Thanks, Becky. So my name is Ryan Perry. I am the current board president of the Academic and Special Libraries section of NYLA, and I also work here at the Central New York Library Resources Council as the digital collections librarian. So the titles are really long based on the names of the organizations mostly. I am very pleased to be here interviewing Beth. Beth is the director of the library at the Strong Museum, and also the past president of the Academic and Special Library section. And, very recently announced she will be the president-elect of NYLA as a whole come November. So again, we're keeping these brief. The idea here is that we can give you guys a quick glimpse into the lives of a special librarian. Special librarians are often doing interesting things that are have their own niche in the library community. And our goal with these Briefinars is to give you a very brief view into what they're up to. So without further ado, we're going to get right into the questions. So welcome, Beth. Thank you for joining us. To start things off, and this is a loaded question with current times, but what does a typical day look like in your library?
Sure. Yeah, I'll give you a typical day, but before, let's say early March 2020.
Before time.
Yes, before time. So we are a research library in archives within the Museum of Play. So our collections are all based on exploring the concept of play, whether that's the objects like the toys and games themselves, or the study of play as an academic pursuit. Video games, we recently expanded more into pinball and arcade games. So as a specialized library, we essentially function like any other research library where people who are researching these topics related to our collections come and research. So we get about 80 to 100 researchers on site a year, and they're usually staying for, I'd say the average stay is about 3 days. There's really so much here, and there's so much that only we have that you really have to sit in and be here for a while. The museum offers some fellowships too, so we get, and those are for longer stays. They could be 2 to 3 weeks. So those are offered 3 times a year, and it's a lot of, there's probably a majority are sort of academic institution-based researchers, so they're working on their dissertation or developing the curriculum for a class that they're doing. We usually don't, at a time, have more than 2 or 3 on site. Sometimes in the summer it gets busier. In the before times we could have up to 6 people here, but we won't be doing that for a while. So there's prep work ahead of time with the researcher. So if I have a researcher coming in 2 weeks, I'm pulling all the materials because we're all closed stacks. So before the researcher's here, I could spend the day pulling library materials, archive materials, working with the curator to bring up objects, so like the dolls or games or toys, coordinating with the video game people if they want to play the video game itself. So, and then once the researcher's here, it's really being there to answer any questions that they have, keep my eagle eyes on them to make sure they're doing everything right. 1 collection, 1 box, 1 folder at a time for archives, so I've got to keep an eye on that. When we don't have researchers, we get a lot of donations in, so we could be, working on donations or organizing materials. There's always cataloging, processing stuff to do. So, but it's really working with the researchers is what a typical day would be.
Cool. Yeah. How many coins does I was going to ask, how many coins does a researcher get for the arcade? As many as they need? Oh,
they have to, yeah, well, it depends. I mean, sometimes I probably could find a couple in my desk, so you could But to play behind the scenes, like if something's out on the floor, then I'm not sure. I don't know if we've had a researcher. I think they've funded their own arcade. But
Yeah.
if the games are behind the scenes, then they don't have to feed them
Yeah.
with coins.
Mostly kidding, but not.
Right.
I mean, sounds like you're doing a lot of work, a lot of typical, research library work, but with very interesting materials. Could you go a little bit more into describing the unique characteristics of your library's collection and services?
Sure. So on the library side, we have about 225,000 volumes. So the library side is magazines, journals, books, a little bit of AV, not too much. But the most unique part of our library collection is our trade catalog collection. So these are catalogs from the doll, toy, game, and video game industry that were sent not directly to the consumer, but to the purchaser for a toy department or a toy store owner or people in the industry. So we have catalogs dated from the late 1800s up into the present, and they are all, well, we're working on getting them all cataloged, but we have a lot of them the records onto WorldCat, so which makes them visible to researchers. Those were all original records because these are really things that you look through, you place your order, and then you toss it. But it traces the history of toy production, particularly in America, from over those years. So it talks about the materials used. It really shows how things were marketed, because you can tell from the pictures how they change from a picture. In the early ones, they showed a kid playing with a toy, because it was kind of like, I don't know what all these people are like, I don't know how a kid would use this toy. So they needed a picture to show like a kid playing, to less of that as, we got into the 60s, 70s and forward. So that's a really unique, we have over 40,000 of those now. Not all of them are cataloged, but we do have them inventoried. So if there's something that is not obvious that we have a way of finding that within our internal databases. On the archive side, we generally divide the archives into 3 categories. So there's archival collections for the study of play. That's sort of the academic look at play from psychology, sociology, education. Collections related to the artifacts of play. So that would be the toy itself, the game itself. There's game company records, that type of thing. And then the largest portion is the ones related to video games. So we have, and that's where most of our growth is. We have the papers of video game designers and video game companies, which is really interesting because they'll have things like the focus groups, and they'll have, schematics, and we're actually just helped somebody via email that wanted to know this part number of a video game arcade machine from Atari, and we looked through and found the parts list. So it could be parts list, schematics, the play fields of the pinball machines, which are like the sketches of where our little bumpers and stuff are, cabinet designs, cabinet art, packaging. That's one of the areas that we're moving into collecting is the marketing materials. So we have things that were how the Sears or JCPenney's should set up this display of these new games that are, that you can play on your Atari 2600. And what else? Yeah, so we have the biggest collection is the Atari coin-op collection, which is one of the biggest ones, and that's not the consumer side, but the arcade side. But our pinball collections are growing a lot too.
And a quick plug, the coin-op collection is available on New York Heritage. So anybody.
Yeah, so we have some pictures that were from that collection. That's just a little sampling. It's on New York Heritage. But the collection itself came to us in 30 pallets, I think. So it's a really large collection. So
not 30 pallets worth of stuff in New York Heritage, but at least you get a taste for it.
Yeah, a little taste, and it links out to our finding aid and stuff. So
yeah, awesome. Yeah, you guys have such an awesome or interesting collection. You know, it's automatically fun because it's hard not to be fun to work with. Right. So you've spoken a little bit about your researchers. Like what are they typically looking for? Like what are your more popular materials?
So recently there's been a lot more interest in the focus group materials, the marketing materials. There's a lot of researchers who are very interested in the treatment of gender and other identities within the video games, also within tracing it back to some of the board games as well. I had a researcher who was looking at the depictions of Native Americans in board games back far. So, and that's really interesting when the curators get to bring up a cart full of these old games. That's really, I get most excited when we have a Barbie researcher because there'll be a cart of Barbies that is brought up to the library. She's making a comeback in the research, especially with the, exploring race and gender. I'm
sure, the current events will impact your research interests as that kind of filters down to the research side and more people justifiably start to look at and question those constructs.
Right. We really sort of looked at it as, games and toys and video games in particular, they're sort of the, are being studied in a way now that film and literature was studied, has been studied in the past. So because there's really narrative, there's really all these elements of essentially storytelling that can be explored from different vantage points. Because a lot of people look at me like, well, what would you possibly study about a video game? And it's just like any other medium, and it's become really advanced in how it, the sort of world it creates and how people interact in it. So I think it's really interesting. I'm not a gamer. My kids are, but I had a 2600. Play Pitfall or whatever, but it's really interesting to hear how people are looking at things. And there's been a lot of uptick and a lot more people interested in role-playing games, and that sort of harkens back to the toy soldiers and war games, and used to play these war games by mail, so that you'd be mailed what the other person did, move their soldiers, and then you'd mail it back. So it's really interesting, kind of things that I had never heard of. So it's always fun to see what people are looking at.
Yeah, games and play inherit a lot of the tropes around representation and gender roles and race and all that. So I think it's the play is really informing a lot of cultural concepts at a very young age. So I think it's great to see more research into play and games. I think that's been missing for a very long time.
Right.
So to move along to our next question, what kind of outreach or partnerships are you involved in? This is of course in the before times, not
yes. So the museum is obviously quite a large institution, so there's definitely a lot of outreach. Other teams are doing, for instance, the education and public programming team. They do a lot of the K-12 school outreach and provide a lot of training for play-based learning and that type of thing. the library and archives, a lot of the outreach and work that we do is in the 4 times we had, for instance, RIT, the Rochester Institute of Technology, has, I think it's called the Magic Department, but it's essentially video game research and design and video game history. So we would have classes come in and do, usually you have the first group come in and, you do a tour of the collections and everything and tell them what they can do at the library and archives, and then they schedule appointments. We've also had some classes from St. John Fisher where we've done, it's again video game history, but we sort of curated what they look at. So, at different levels, because for a regular researcher, we would say, look at our catalogs and databases, and you tell us what you want to see, and then we'll pull it for you. But early undergraduate, there's a little bit more of we pulled these things, these magazines for you because they have, consumer reviews of products or stuff like that, and sort of really, in this, our archival collection has these elements that you'll find interesting. So there's a little bit more hand-holding at the lower levels. But at this point, we've talked about how to do the tours virtually. We could, produce something that gives, lets you look at some of the storage areas and some of the materials, and records our little spiel that we give to all the classes that come through. We don't have a whole lot of our collections. We do have digital representation, but it's not to the point that, some people just assume an entire, of course you're going to scan this whole thing and put it online, but, there's different considerations like intellectual property and all kinds of things. So the actual research itself is really limited at this point. We also work with, through the Rochester Regional Library Council, we have a little group we call RASCL, which is the Rochester Area Special Collections, Archives, and Libraries. It took us a long time to come up with a perfect acronym and name for ourselves, but this is sort of all the special people around the Rochester area. So historical societies, the Medical Museum and Archives, the Rochester Museum and Science Center, people from the MAG, which is the Memorial Art Gallery, Visual Studies Workshop, the Local History Division of the RPL, and sort of all of the people that have these special collections and archives and objects, and sort of, we don't sort of fit in neatly into all the, public libraries, academic libraries, school libraries. We might touch on all of those things, but so we get together quarterly and usually tour, well, the 4 times we toured each other's facilities and oohed and awed at the new storage that people would get, or if they have particularly attractive archival boxes, we really enjoy looking at that. And then we'll usually have a topic that we talk about when we have a virtual meeting coming up this month, and it's going to be a lot of like, how are you changing how you accommodate researchers in the new times. But we've talked about like archival theft, salting the archives, which is where somebody plants something fake into an archive so that it becomes part of the historical record. And yeah, we kind of talk about whatever we're interested in. We've talked about working with interns and college students, and just sort of looking at things from our unique perspective. So and we've been put on, well, I don't know if it has this year, but we put on an archives fair every year in October where we all have tables and sort of can show off our collections and services to the community.
That's a really cool idea. We tried to, I think we were looking to maybe replicate that eventually in our region.
Yeah.
I like how you guys have that great community, because you end up as a library and a museum, you end up being kind of shuttle off to the side a little bit sometimes. Yeah. It's good to have that network.
Yeah.
I want to ask one more final question, and then we'll have some time for questions from the audience. I guess this question, as any question in this period of time, is loaded. But I was wondering if you could describe briefly how things changed since you started working at the Strong, and what kind of change you'd like to see in the future.
Yeah, I've been here 5 years, and definitely the biggest thing since I've been here is the amount of digital archiving and digital preservation that we need to do. So since I've been here, we've acquired, large scanners for paper material, but also equipment to digitize U-matic tapes, beta, VHS. We also have equipment, it's called the CryoFlux, and that essentially lets you disk image 5 1/4 and 3 1/2 inch floppy disks. We actually got grants through RLC to do some of this because the archival collections that we're getting are from early, I guess people call them now early game designers, but, as a child of the 80s, I'm like, that's not early. That's, that was just a little while ago. But, they had, 8-inch discs. They had all these different media. And, if this disc was used, maybe overwritten a couple of times back in 1990, is it even readable? And if it has like a label that's been scratched out or the adhesive has come off, who even knows what's on it? So we've been trying to, initially you want to image everything so that you have it, because the media is gonna die. It's just gonna be a block of plastic, and then looking into how do you then be able to interpret what's actually on that disc. Because it's easy, if they use like WordStar, you can convert that to a word processing thing now, and then save it as a PDF, and that's fine. But if it's some kind of software or a game build, or the other easy one is the early CAD drawings. We can figure out how to do those. But some of it is like you kind of wait for somebody to create an emulator for this old game. And then there's a lot of pressure, like I mentioned before, for, there's an assumption in the video game world that everything should be available online. And that's not, not only is that expensive to do and to store and to maintain, but there's also intellectual property issues with archival collections and even just library collections. We can't just scan everything and put it up. So
and the emulation issue, you could put the files up and nobody could use them.
Yeah, and then we also have source code. Like we can't just post somebody's source code that somebody wrote that. So there's been, I think the biggest change is the move to the digital preservation. So that's been a huge learning curve. And also I'm surprised at how many times we really have to go over intellectual property and the cost of data storage to the people, even in our institution, that, well, why can't we do this? It's sort of their role to dream big, and then they have my archivist and I come into the meeting with the IT director and be like, no, this is really expensive. We can't do this. So, but that's the biggest change.
Briefly, anything you want to see change, or what you're looking forward to in the future? Then maybe we can get a question in the next 5 minutes or so.
Probably in the before times I could have told you what my goals were, but now it's really just I want to make sure that we can protect what we have, which is, digital as well as paper. So it's really, sort of looking internally, like trying to make sure that we're not taking on too much, that we can really perform our core tasks as best as we can right now, not being able to accommodate outside researchers very often and stuff like that. So
yeah, just finding ways to reach your clientele, your users
yeah.
without, yeah. It's funny how the answers to a lot of these questions might have been completely different
Right.
6 months ago. So
Yeah.
all right, well, I don't know if we